Um, Hello everyone. Today I'm at a conference at the University of Sheffield in England, and I met an amazing historian from Wales, Dr. Nathan Smith from Museum of Wales, who will introduce us to the beginnings of foraging workshops in Britain. I always thought this is just the beginning of the 21st century. But actually, he found some much older data about amazing events associated with collecting mushrooms and teaching people collecting mushrooms.
Yes, so I look at the history of mycology in Britain, we said the UK, but in Britain, and how it kind of emerges in the 1800s from these isolated individuals who are like stuck writing letters to each other, often like reverends or generally people of a lower class than botanists. They're writing to each other.
So how did they teach people collecting mushrooms?
So initially, you tend to have a lot of people kind of sending samples to each other.
Okay.
So like, oh, here's the sample. This is what this is. Have a look at it. And then you have these kind of like competitions to get these collections together as a way of like, you have some books, one or two, very few. Mainly the one by Berkeley on Introduction to Fungology or British Fungology.
Okay.
But then, and this is where Henry Graves Bull and the Woolip Club come in, he introduces this idea of the a foray amongst the funguses.
Okay. The foray. So what was the foray?
So a foray, and it's still practiced today, is just kind of like scientific exploration of fungi, where you meet up in a very random way. You walk around the woods, you collect the fungi, you identify them, but particularly for the Woolip Club, you identify them and then you eat them. And so it's this big social event combined with this big scientific event where you meet all these people you've been writing to. You spend 4 days in a pub, drinking, going out, collecting mushrooms, singing songs, and eating these mushrooms and trying them out.
When was the first meeting like this organized?
It's about 1873, I believe.
In which part of Britain?
It's Woolip, which, you know what, these are the...
Which county?
I think it's Herefordshire.
Okay.
Yes, Herefordshire. And so you have these, like it's towards the, I think it's 1873 or thereabouts. I'm possibly wrong on that date, so please comment below if I'm wrong. But yeah, and they kind of like build up and they grow and grow and grow. And the first one is just a one-day affair. And then within a couple of years, there are these big 4-day affairs where the eating is part of the scientific exploration, and they're eating and they're studying and they're eating and they're studying, and they kind of interact with each other.
So how often would they meet?
Once a year.
Once a year. Okay.
And that's the autumn foray that we now have, and it's quite embedded in mycological culture. Is this idea that you have you have an autumn foray and more recently a spring foray.
So would only specialists come, or would there be people wanting to learn mushrooms come as well?
So at the Woolip Club, it's mainly specialists.
Many specialists.
But we see it. So when the Woolip Club, when Henry Graves Bull dies, the Yorkshire mycologists take over,
Okay.
and we know from their records that they invite students, and they're very happy, and they brag even that they have students come to them to learn how to find fungi and identify them. And it's something they're very proud about. So increasingly, you have less and less specialists as they take on this pedagogical, educational role.
Okay, so when would be the period when they organize like courses for non-specialists or advertise them?
So it comes in towards the 1890s. So Massey, George Edward Massey, who's based at Kew, organises teaching for the gardeners on how to identify plant pathogens. So you see, and this is deliberately designed as non-specialist teaching. In terms of like formal, it's difficult because forays are kind of built in this terms. You have an expert who is your referee, and they will take you around the woods and they will help identify stuff.
Okay.
But it's a really kind of casual thing where like it's all of these things stacked on. You're there for scientific investigation, you're there for learning, and you're there for socializing, and it's fulfilling all three of these purposes.
Would they make dishes out of mushrooms?
Yes, and so it's quite fantastic for the Woolip Club. One of the attendees is Mordecai Cupid, who's fantastically verbose and he writes beautifully. He has an initial career as a poet. He fails drastically, but he writes beautifully. We've got Worthington, George Smith, and they talk about like how they have these beautiful meals of fungi they didn't quite know what to do with. So they look at it and go, yeah, that's probably edible. And they'd have these huge multi-course meals where they'd make a dish, they'd pass it around, and they'd pass judgment on it about whether it's worth doing again, whether it was good, whether it was bad, what was good, what was bad about it.
So there was trial and error, and were there many fatalities? Were there many dead people?
There's no fatalities to my knowledge.
And vomiting, like,
almost
some
certainly.
indigestion?
Almost certainly. I've not seen any records of it, but I fully believe that there was some unpleasantness there.
But do they mention like feeling bad after some mushrooms, like slight indigestion or
I don't know. In the records I've seen, they don't. But there are certainly later mycologists who do this, where they try out a meal and then they record in a large amount of detail how ill they got eating it.
Would they try fly agaric?
I don't know, but Mordecai Cupid Cook, who was one of these attendees, wrote the Seven Sisters of Sleep, so he knew about the fly agaric.
So what date is the book from?
Oh, I think it's from before the Forays. It's one of his first books.
19th century, yes.
19th century and mid 19th century.
Okay. Seven Sisters of Sleep, yeah.
Yes, and one of the Sisters of Sleep is the fly agaric, which he calls, I believe, the exile from Siberia, and he kind of really taps into this ethnomycological work that's kind of spinning around, and he's the first person to kind of like put it in one place and really popularise it.
Would they know psilocybe?
It's unclear.
Unclear.
From what I understand, psilocybe only really enters into the UK drug use in the 1970s. It's not really known as such beforehand, and the reason for that is that a lot of foraging, as we now, occurs in forests, because when you're actomycorrhizal fungi, your big ones, whereas psilocybe grows in pasture. And so it's less likely to be foraged for that reason, and less likely to be eaten. Obviously, it grows from feces. You don't want to be eating. People. But I think there's a book, and I forget the book of it, that kind of introduces. It's by another cook, who is the first person to mention in the UK language that, oh, by the way, these are psychedelic mushrooms.
In the 20th century.
In the 20th century, it's an introduction to mycology by I think it's Robert Cook, and he's the first person, I believe, to mention it. One of the first people to mention it.
So you mentioned like feasting and drinking.
Yes.
So would they have good fun? Yeah.
Yeah, they talk about getting these very old ports out, like multiple-year-old ports. They're really quite big affairs. Everyone dresses up. They have this very mythological sense about it. So there's drawings of Henry Graves' Bull as like a mycological Jesus figure handing out the food, and they give themselves all these identities and performance. It's a very performative act.
What kind of people were they? Were they aristocrats?
No, so it's mixed. You'd probably say they're coming from the lower middle classes. So Cook, he spent some time as a draper. He then spent some time as a teacher. He's very aspirational, but he never quite cracks into that like upper scientific society that we might perceive with like the Linnaean society and the Royal Society. He's always that little step below, and the same for Worthington, George Smith. They're both very aspirational, but very much lower middle class. So
can we find these poems about mushrooms somewhere in some archives, or?
Yes. So Cook, there is some archives in Kew with some poems about Henry Graves' Bull that Cook did. They're also in the book about Cook by Mary English called Mordecai Cupid Cook, Victorian naturalist, mycologist, something eccentric. And there's also, he wrote poems for the Queckett Microscopic Club. And their poems are there. They're very much of their time, but you can find some of them, and they're set to music.
And the music, and is the music preserved, or is it given like?
They use traditional songs, so it's like this song to the tune of this song.
Okay. And are the recipes preserved somewhere?
There are some recipes, yes, and there's various accounts. Again, one of the menus actually is preserved. When they have the big celebration of Henry Graves' Bull, he did a big book on apples, and they celebrated it with this big feast, and we have the menu preserved, and it's quite beautifully drawn and beautifully
exquisite. Who hosted them?
It was the Green Dragon Hotel.
Okay, Green Dragon Hotel. Sounds Welsh.
It is, but no, it's in Herefordshire, and I believe it's still going. I did look it up the other
Okay.
day, but I'm not sure it's the right one. But there's the
Fantastic.
Green Dragon Hotel, and they could stay there, and they mythologize it, and it's great.
Was there continuation in the 20th century? Like, did it die out, or there was some tradition of doing it further?
So the Wool Up Club died out a couple of years after Henry Gravesbull died. There wasn't really anyone that locally take it up.
Okay.
Then, like I said, it was taken over by the Yorkshire, and forays still exist today, and they kind of follow that same format. They're still, the BMS foray is still, I believe it's a 4-day event.
Okay.
There's this big emphasis on sociability, work hard, play hard.
So
so
is
that
this
type
British
of-
Mycological Society does it? No.
Yes, the BMS.
Okay.
They do 2 forays. They do one in autumn, and they do one in spring, and lots of other local societies. There's more than 40 independent local societies across the UK. They also do forays.
And you mentioned to me that there are waves of interest in mushrooms in Britain. Yeah, there's not like steady, but there are some periods when mushrooms were trendy,
Yes.
edible mushrooms, and people were learning them, and then stopping. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you like quote dates where they were trendy?
Yeah, so we see a little bit of the trend comes up in the 1840s with the microscope coming up. Suddenly you can look at mushrooms and identify what they are. They become even more popular in about the 1860s when the microscope becomes affordable. Suddenly everyone can get involved. You have this big boom in civic pride into the 1880s through to the 1900s when they're popular. You then have a boom in the First World War and the Second World War. During parts of rationing, mushrooms, of course, were free foods.
Okay.
And notably in the Second World War, there's this recognition of Eastern European immigrants bringing this mycological knowledge.
Mainly Polish.
Mainly Polish.
Yeah. The Polish pilots. Yeah.
Yes, and then they're noted explicitly as they're bringing this knowledge across.
Okay.
To say, we recognise that these people have come over here and given us more knowledge and increased trends in mushrooms. And then it's another 20 years when you have this big rise in kind of food foraging, kind of exemplified by what's the famous book, Roger Phillips mushrooms.
Roger Phillips, yeah.
That's that another big boom there, where it's like it's all good to like harvest
An
your own
amazing
food.
man, I met him.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's absolutely wonderful.
So what was the beginning, like before these clubs? I mean, was there any trace of mushroom collecting traditions in Britain, or was it already brought by some foreigners before?
We don't know. What we do know is Henry Gravesbull calls mushrooms like manna for the poor. So it's done by poor people whose records don't often survive that well.
Were there any pamphlets during the war written
Yes.
advising people about cooking mushrooms?
There were, and quite fantastically, John Ramsbottom in the Second World War, he was the keeper of the herbarium in what we now call the Natural History Museum, but the British Museum brackets Natural History, and he writes in the papers and says, if you want to know about mushrooms, send me your mushrooms and I'll identify them for you. I want you to forage safely. And so it's this very big war effort where like you could write to the keeper of the herbarium, I've got this mushroom, is it edible? And I've got one of his letters where he replies and gives a beautiful recipe for mushroom ketchup.
Wow.
So it says like, yes, this is edible, it goes really well in this recipe.
Okay, but Britain has a lot of pasture, and in the pasture you can find field mushrooms, which are easy and safe to identify.
Yes.
And was there any local tradition of actually using field mushrooms?
I don't
No.
know. I don't know.
What about chanterelles? It's another kind of mushroom that's easy, to learn, and like French influence could bring it quite early.
Yes, so we do see in some early cookbooks, and mushrooms are recognised as very French.
Okay.
Like, the French recommend eating them. But like I say, we know that like in the document around sometimes Magna Carta, the rights of free men to forage mushrooms is mentioned. But
In the Magna Carta?
in the document ancillary to it, I forget. I've forgotten
Which
my
century
names.
is it?
Magna Carta century.
Okay.
So it's very early on. But we know they have that right. We just don't have the records, and as we were actually hearing in the conference today, it's really difficult to kind of find remains of mushrooms in.
Yeah. And the
in
problem
skeletons.
with collecting mushrooms in Britain is that many of the woodlands are private, and you're not allowed to access it. In Poland, we have the kind of right. Everyone roams around and collects mushrooms even in my forest. So here it would be more difficult to actually freely forage.
Yeah.
Nathan, thank you very much for this really inspiring, interesting review, because I wrote this paper about foragers in Britain, and I didn't know that this whole foraging tradition and foraying tradition is so old, goes back to the 19th century. So I hope you can write some paper about it.
Oh, thank you for interviewing me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank